I was driving down an empty stretch of highway late at night, my headlights cutting through the darkness. The road stretched endlessly ahead, lined by thick forests on either side. I had been driving for hours, trying to make it to my sister's house before dawn. The sound of my tires on the pavement was the only thing keeping me company. The highway was eerie. No other cars, no streetlights, just me, my old sedan, and the whisper of the wind outside. I turned up the radio, but even that didn't help the strange feeling in my chest. Something about this stretch of road felt off. Around midnight, I saw the first sign. A bent, rusted road sign stood on the side of the highway. It read, "Beware, road ends ahead." I frowned. That didn't make sense. The map on my phone said this highway would take me all the way to my sister's town, but I hadn't seen any exits for miles. The GPS was glitchy, probably because there was no signal out here. Ignoring the sign, I kept driving. After all, where else could I go? Then, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. It was faint at first, just a shimmer of light far behind me. A car, maybe? Finally, I wasn't alone on this creepy road. But as I kept glancing back, the light didn't seem to get closer. Instead, it flickered, like a dying flame. The uneasiness grew stronger. Another sign appeared a few miles later. This one was worse. "Turn back now." My stomach twisted. Who put these signs here? Was it some kind of prank? I laughed nervously to myself, but it sounded hollow in the silence. Suddenly, my car sputtered. The engine coughed twice, and then the dashboard lit up with warnings. I swore under my breath and pulled over to the shoulder. Popping the hood, I stepped out into the cold night air. It was eerily quiet, no crickets, no wind, just nothing. As I stared at the engine, pretending I knew what I was doing, I noticed movement in the trees. A shadow darted between the trunks. My heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" I called out. No response. I climbed back into the car, locking the doors. The strange light in the rearview mirror was gone now, replaced by a deep darkness. I tried the ignition again. The car roared to life and I let out a shaky breath. "Okay," I muttered. "Just keep driving. Get off this road." But as I pulled back onto the highway, the GPS flickered back on, showing a bright red line. The words across the screen sent chills down my spine. "Turn around. Danger ahead." My hands tightened on the wheel. I didn't trust the GPS anymore, but I didn't trust the road either. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the highway. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop just a few feet from them. The figure didn't move. It was tall and thin, dressed in black. Its face was hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. "Hey!" I shouted through the window. "Are you okay?" No response. I honked the horn. The sound echoed, but the figure didn't flinch. My chest tightened as I realized. They weren't human. The figure tilted its head, almost curiously, and then it raised an arm. It pointed to the forest. "No way," I whispered. My car wouldn't reverse. The brakes locked up and the engine sputtered again. The figure began walking toward me, slow and deliberate. Panic set in. I threw the car into drive and swerved around it, tires screeching as I sped down the highway. My heart pounded as I glanced in the mirror. It was gone. But then I saw the lights. Dozens of glowing orbs appeared in the trees, moving parallel to the highway. They floated like fireflies, but they were too bright, too deliberate. They were watching me. The road started to change. The asphalt cracked and buckled, and the lines on the pavement twisted into jagged shapes. The trees leaned closer to the road, their branches clawing at the sky. I drove faster, my hands trembling on the wheel. The GPS screen turned black and the radio blasted static. And then, through the noise, I heard a voice. "You should have turned back." Something slammed into the side of the car, sending it skidding across the road. I fought for control, but the steering wheel felt like it had a mind of its own. The car veered off the highway and into the forest. I hit the brakes, but the car wouldn't stop. It sped deeper into the woods, the headlights illuminating twisted trees and shadows that moved too fast. Then, the car stopped on its own. The engine died, and the lights flickered out. I was plunged into darkness. I sat there, frozen, until I saw them. Figures surrounded the car, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, it was morning. My car was parked neatly on the side of a different highway, the engine running smoothly. There were no signs of the figures, the twisted road, or the glowing lights. But the message on my GPS screen stayed with me long after I reached my sister's house. You escaped. This tea time. It was supposed to be a routine drive home. I'd taken the same highway for years, and I could probably navigate it with my eyes closed. But that night, I decided to take a shortcut. The GPS said it would save me 10 minutes, and after a long day at work, those 10 minutes sounded like a gift. The shortcut started as a narrow, unlit road branching off the highway. It was empty, not a single car in sight, and the deeper I drove, the more isolated it felt. The streetlights stopped after the first mile, leaving only my headlights to pierce the thick darkness. I glanced at the GPS, but the map had frozen. The little blue dot stuck in place. Great, I muttered, smacking the screen. I figured I'd stay on the road until I hit the next turn or sign, but the longer I drove, the more the road stretched endlessly ahead. The trees on either side seemed unnaturally close, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows that danced in my peripheral vision. Then I saw something strange. Up ahead, there was a car pulled over on the side of the road. Its hazard lights blinked weakly, casting orange flashes into the surrounding darkness. As I slowed down, I noticed a man standing beside the car, waving me down. I hesitated. Something about the scene didn't sit right with me. His movements were stiff, almost robotic, and his face was shadowed, even in the glow of my headlights. Against my better judgment, I stopped a few feet away and rolled down the window slightly. "Are you okay?" I called out. The man didn't answer right away. He lowered his hand and tilted his head like he was studying me. Then he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that made my skin crawl. "You're going the wrong way," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward the trees, disappearing into the shadows without another word. My instincts screamed at me to leave, and I slammed on the gas, speeding away from the scene. For a while, the road was empty again, but my nerves were on edge. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man running after me. But what I saw instead was worse. The car, the one with the blinking hazards, was back. It was parked on the shoulder, exactly where it had been before. My heart pounded as I realized I had somehow looped back to the same spot. This time, the man wasn't there. The driver's door hung open, swinging gently in the breeze. I didn't stop. I pressed the pedal harder, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. The road ahead seemed to stretch forever, the trees blurring into dark walls on either side. My phone had no signal, and the GPS was still frozen. I tried to focus on driving, but the more I stared at the road, the more it felt like it wasn't real. Like I was stuck in some endless, repeating nightmare. Then I saw the car again. But this time, it was in the middle of the road, its headlights glaring directly at me. I swerved, narrowly avoiding a collision, and skidded to a stop. My heart raced as I looked back, but the car was gone. The road behind me was breathing heavily. I sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I noticed something in the rearview mirror, a figure standing in the middle of the road far behind me. It was the man from before, but now he was closer, much closer. I didn't wait to see what he would do. Slamming the car into drive, I sped off, my tires screeching on the asphalt. The road twisted and turned unnaturally, like it was alive and deliberately trying to confuse me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, shadows darting between the trees, keeping pace with my car. I didn't dare look directly at them, but I could feel their presence, closing in on me. After what felt like hours, I saw lights ahead, a gas station. Relief flooded through me as I pulled in and parked. The station looked old and deserted, but at least it was a sign of civilization. I stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling weakly. The air was stale, and the shelves were half empty. Behind the counter sat an older man, his face pale and expressionless. "Can I help you?" he asked in a monotone voice. "Yes," I said, my voice shaky. "I'm lost. I don't know how to get back to the highway." The man stared at me for a long moment before speaking. "You shouldn't have taken this road," he said quietly. "It doesn't let people—" Before I could respond, the lights flickered, and for a brief second, the room went completely dark. When the lights came back on, the man was gone, and the door behind me was wide open. I ran back to my car, but something was wrong. The road I had come from wasn't there anymore. Instead, a narrow dirt path stretched into the woods, its end shrouded in thick fog. I had no choice but to follow it. As I drove, the fog grew thicker, and the shadows around me seemed to close in. The trees became warped, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. My headlights barely illuminated the path, and I had to fight the urge to stop and turn back. Eventually, the path opened up into a clearing. In the center stood the man, his unnatural grin still plastered across his face. Behind him was my car, the same one I was driving, parked and idling silently. I slammed on the brakes, my mind spinning. The man raised his hand, pointing directly at me, and whispered, "You should have listened." The last thing I remember is the sound of my engine sputtering and dying, leaving me in complete silence. When I woke up, I was back on the main highway, the sun rising in the distance. But something wasn't right. My car didn't feel the same, and when I looked in the mirror, the person staring back at me wasn't me. I was heading home after visiting a friend in a nearby city, driving along Highway 87 late at night. The road was dark and empty, with only the steady hum of my car engine for company. It had been a long day, and I was eager to get home and collapse into bed. The GPS said I had about 2 hours left to go, so I settled in for the ride. About 30 minutes into the drive, I noticed something odd, a sign on the side of the road. It was old and faded, but I could still make out the words, "Rest stop ahead." That wasn't strange on its own, but I was sure I hadn't passed a rest stop on this highway during the trip to my friend's house. Shaking off the thought, I kept driving. 15 minutes later, I passed the same sign again. At least, it looked like the same one. The words were identical, and it was in the same state of disrepair. I frowned, glancing at the GPS. It showed a straight line, with no loops or turns that would bring me back to the same spot. Maybe I was tired and imagining things. Another 15 minutes passed, and there it was again. The same sign, in the same position, with the same message. This time, I pulled over. I needed to clear my head and check my surroundings. Grabbing a flashlight from the glove box, I stepped out into the cool night air. The silence was unnerving. No wind, no chirping crickets. Nothing but the soft rumble of my car engine. I walked over to the sign and ran my hand across its surface. The paint was peeling, and the metal was cold to the touch. This sign had been here for years. I looked down the highway in both directions, but the road stretched endlessly into darkness. Getting back into the car, I decided to drive faster. I thought if I pushed through, I could break out of this strange loop. The trees on either side of the road blurred as I sped up, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. Then, the headlights caught something up ahead. It was a figure standing in the middle of the highway. Slamming on the brakes, I skidded to a stop just a few feet away. The figure didn't move. It was a man, dressed in a tattered jacket and jeans, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "Hey!" I called, rolling down the window slightly. "Are you okay?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, staring at me, or at least, I thought he was staring. I couldn't see his eyes under the shadow of the hat. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed something else. His feet weren't touching the ground. I threw the car into reverse, heart pounding as I backed away. The man didn't follow, but the road behind me seemed to stretch longer than it should have. No matter how far I reversed, the figure stayed the same distance away, like he was glued to that spot. Panicking, I shifted back into drive and swerved around him, speeding down the highway. My heart raced as I glanced in the rearview mirror, but he was gone. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and the GPS. The map still showed a straight line, but the timer hadn't budged. 2 hours to go. 2 hours that never seemed to end. As the minutes dragged on, I started to notice other things. The trees along the road looked identical, like they were copy-pasted over and over. The stars above didn't shift in the sky, no matter how far I drove. And then, the sign appeared again, "Rest stop ahead." This time, the neon lights of a gas station flickered in the distance. Desperate for a break, I pulled in. The place looked abandoned, with broken windows and rusted pumps. Still, I got out, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. As I approached the entrance, the door creaked open on its own. The air inside was stale and cold, like no one had been there in years. I called out, but my voice echoed back at me, unanswered. That's when I saw it. My reflection in the dusty mirror behind the counter. It wasn't me. The figure in the mirror wore my clothes and had my face, but its eyes were hollow, and its mouth twisted into a sinister grin. I stumbled back, crashing into a shelf, and bolted for the door. When I got back to the car, it wouldn't start. The engine clicked and sputtered, refusing to turn over. The highway was silent and dark, the gas station looming behind me like a forgotten tomb. I don't remember how long I sat there, staring at the empty road ahead. Eventually, the sun rose, and everything seemed normal again. The car started as if nothing had happened, and I drove home without further incident. But every now and then, when I'm driving late at night, I see that sign again, rest stop ahead, and I know the highway hasn't let me go. It began as a simple late-night drive home. I had stayed too long at my friend's place, and by the time I hit the road, it was past midnight. The highway was empty, just a long stretch of black asphalt surrounded by endless trees. At first, the solitude was comforting. The hum of the engine, the cool night air, and the occasional flash of headlights from passing trucks all felt normal. My GPS said I had about 2 hours to go, but as the minutes passed, something felt odd. The first sign of trouble came when I noticed the same billboard twice. It was an old advertisement for a soda brand that I didn't even think existed anymore. The first time, I barely paid attention, just noting the peeling paint and faded colors. But when I saw it again about 20 minutes later, my stomach churned. It wasn't just similar, it was the exact same billboard, down to the graffiti scrawled in the corner. Confused, I glanced at the GPS. It still showed a straight line, no loops or exits. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just a coincidence, and kept driving. Another 20 minutes passed and there it was again, the same billboard. My chest tightened. This time, I slowed down and studied my surroundings. The trees looked identical, the cracks in the road in the same places. My heart began to race as I realized I wasn't moving forward. I was stuck, somehow driving the same stretch of highway over and over. Determined to break the cycle, I sped up, gripping the wheel tightly. My eyes scanned for any sign of a turn or an exit, but the road stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by the same rows of trees. The longer I drove, the more I noticed things that didn't make sense. The moon, which had been bright and full when I started, seemed to fade, leaving the sky darker than it should have been. The stars disappeared one by one, until the only light came from my car's headlights. Then, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, a woman in a tattered dress with long, messy hair. She didn't move as I approached, and I instinctively slowed down. Her face was obscured by shadows, but as my headlights hit her, I noticed something strange. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She seemed to hover just above the pavement. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving, and I pressed the gas, swerving slightly to avoid her. In the rearview mirror, she stood motionless, her head turning slowly to watch me as I drove away. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. I wanted to believe it was just my tired mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew better. I checked my phone for a signal, desperate to call someone, anyone, but there was nothing. The GPS was frozen, the screen stuck on the same stretch of highway I'd been driving all night. Hours seemed to pass, though the clock on my dashboard barely moved. The highway began to feel alive, the trees bending inward like they were trying to trap me. The air grew colder, and the shadows on the road seemed to stretch and twist, almost like they were reaching for my car. That's when I saw the diner. It appeared out of nowhere, glowing faintly in the distance. A neon sign flickered above the door, spelling out the word "open" in uneven letters. The parking lot was empty, but the lights inside were on. I pulled in, desperate for a break and some human interaction. As I stepped out of the car, the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. The diner's interior was dated, with faded vinyl booths and a jukebox that looked like it hadn't worked in years. A man sat behind the counter, his back to me, hunched over as if he hadn't moved in hours. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The man turned slowly, revealing a gaunt face and hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. Before I could respond, the lights in the diner flickered, and when they came back on, the man was gone. The door slammed shut behind me, and for a moment, I was paralyzed with fear. I ran back to my car, locking the doors as I started the engine. The diner's lights went out completely, leaving the parking lot bathed in darkness. The highway loomed ahead, the only path I could take. I drove faster than I ever had, but no matter how far I went, the diner reappeared, its neon sign flickering in the distance. The next time I passed it, the figure of the woman stood in the doorway, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way out, but the road seemed endless, stretching into eternity. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have blacked out. When I woke, I was sitting in my car on the side of the highway. The sun was rising, casting warm light over the landscape. Everything looked normal again. The GPS was working, and the road ahead finally led me home. I tried to convince myself it had all been a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by lack of sleep, but even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me back. At night, when I drive alone, I still see flashes of that highway. Endless trees, the flickering diner, and the woman's hollow eyes staring back at me in the mirror.